Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Our panelists already lined up. So let's convene tonight's summit. And today, joining us from Washington, D.C., Jonathan Schanzer is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. From South Carolina, Arash Azizi, Senior Lecturer of History at the Clemson University. And here in our Tel Aviv studios, International Affairs Analyst Dan Perry. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you so very much for joining us today as our main topic. From ground zero to a zero-sum game, perhaps. It's been 22 years, wow, since the terror attack that changed the world as we know it. Is it a safer or a more dangerous one now? What is the long-enduring legacy of 9/11? Let's take a closer look and pick up the conversation from there. Yeah. All right. All right, gentlemen, let's cut to the chase. We really do not need any introduction when it comes to this topic. So let's begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we pick it up from there. What is the remaining legacy of 9/11? Mr. Schanzer, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Our legacy is that we have destroyed the efficacy of al-Qaeda. It's certainly not a dead organization, but it has been significantly hobbled and it's been pushed into the shadows. However, we have normalized ties and even legitimized the Taliban, which I think gives al-Qaeda an opportunity for a resurgence if we're not careful. I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have turned out to be disastrous. So that element of the war on terror has certainly failed. But the key objective of destroying al-Qaeda or weaken it significantly, I think, still remains.
Arash Azizi, your thoughts?
I agree that there was the effect of weakening al-Qaeda significantly, and many American men and women did dedicate much of their lives to this, and after all, they did successfully prevent another attack on U.S. soil. But the broader problems, I'll point to two. One is that Middle East is really not necessarily a more stable place today, and there is unfortunately ground again for growth of terrorist organizations as we've seen in recent years. And the other one is that the response to 9/11 really put an end to a more to a sort of different form of politics. But my time is up, so maybe throughout
You're
the conversation.
Too polite, Mr. Azizi. Last but not least, Dan Perry, your take?
The 9/11 attacks were the last coffin and the nail of a decade of euphoria in the West, and particularly in the U.S. that followed the collapse of communism and that somehow survived the war in Yugoslavia and other calamities of the 90s. And the legacy is widespread distrust of Islam and even of Muslims, understandable obsession about security and terrorism, devastating wars that left the Middle East in ashes and weren't that successful. And of course, it took the joy out of flying entirely.
Yeah, you can no longer just hop on a plane with a plastic bag, can you? Maybe for the better. Gentlemen, on that note, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And perhaps let's begin from the fringes of this discussion. Mr. Perry perhaps alluding to it in his opening remarks. Did 9/11 increase or decrease the public trust in governments generally, in world order, if you will, Mr. Schanzer?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. On the one hand, I do think there was an immense amount of trust placed in the U.S. government in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Certainly the measures taken for homeland security, the wars that were prosecuted in Afghanistan and Iraq, they received the backing of the majority of the American public for many years. However, I would argue that as we struggled to win in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States lost face. We lost our standing in the world. That lone superpower status, I think, was weakened significantly, certainly by Afghanistan, and without question, that really hasty withdrawal that led to the return of the Taliban just 2 years ago, that did a lot of damage. And in the process, we're now looking at the process aspect of what many people would call a multipolar world, where we see, China, Russia, other countries looking to fill a vacuum left by a United States that is increasingly isolationist in nature as a result of those failed wars.
Yeah, I really would agree. I mentioned that it was the end of a decade of euphoria. It was also the end of the decade of unipolarity, and America's status as the only major global superpower. And also, I think you have to look at it from an even longer standpoint. For a number of decades now, the idea of the omnipotence of major global powers has taken a beating, beginning maybe with the Vietnam War. The fact that the U.S. failed to pacify Iraq, really, and utterly left Afghanistan in a shambles, has put such pressure on the idea of the U.S. As a potent global power that the reaction is increasingly a growing force in public opinion that militates for isolationism and for withdrawal from the world, which may be a good thing and may be a bad thing, but it certainly is not, America at its greatest.
So Russia's easy. Are American democracy promotion escapades completely over now?
Well, let me actually sort of point out to another fact, like when we do history, perhaps a surprising history that I think in terms of 9/11, is that before 9/11, you had, for example, a very lively counter globalization movement. Is sort of what it was called, or alter globalization. You had really, you were after the fall of the Soviet Union, you were having the beginning of a rise of as a sort of a left that critiqued social inequalities in the West. And I think, unfortunately, the turn to the regardless of what your politics is, the turn to security and the turn to these, if you were easy enemies like Al Qaeda, these terrorist groups who were, after all, no match for U.S.'s military power, really led to I think, displaced priorities. That the rising inequality in the United States, in many Western countries, the rise of which have now fueled the rise of sort of far-right parties, of course, both in this country and in Europe. These are some of the more important legacies, I think, of 9/11, that really they led to, as it's called, displaced priorities. And I think that has a really enduring legacy. And it also has to do with the fact, we can talk about isolationism, some democracy promotion. We can talk about all of these things from a variety of perspectives. But the key thing is that the Iraq War, of course, was a disaster. But I think the key thing here is that the rise of a bit of a multipolar world was in some ways inevitable as other countries sort of rise in power. But I think for a very long time, U.S.'s direction was again not at sort of more important questions like how to deal with China, how to deal with Russia, but as I said, sort of very easy enemies, both militarily and strategically. I think it was a blunder to not to pay so much attention there.
Yeah.
And of course, on the question of the Middle East, and the last thing I'll say on the question of the Middle East, this is the third president in a row, President Biden, who wants to get out of the Middle East. And they turn out.
You want to get out, but they pull you back in, right? Isn't it? When we're talking about the Middle Eastern quagmire. But to that point, exactly, Jonathan Schanzer, did counterterrorism, to an extent, consume too much energy and resources to the extent where other threats were overlooked? Obviously, easier in hindsight, but and yet.
Yeah, on average, I think in the beginning, I would disagree with that. As time went on, I think it was a waste of money. But actually, I don't think it was the counterterrorism budgets that concerned me as much as the democracy promotion or state-building budgets that came alongside these endeavors in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and beyond. I think that's where the money has not been well spent. We saw a huge amount of corruption. We saw very little in terms of yield. And so we've gotten to the point, unfortunately, where I think most Americans and maybe even kind of global citizens have just simply given up on the prospect of trying to change the Middle East. There's a sense that the Middle East is a basket case, that there is no changing the dynamics in that part of the world. Now, there are, of course, some outliers. I would argue that countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have made surprising turns toward reform. But outside of the Gulf, I would be hard-pressed to point to any gains that were made either during that concerted effort or after. And I think that is really the concern that a lot of Americans have today about spending money abroad.
And even in those two countries, it's hardly democracy, the reforms you speak about.
Right. And staying perhaps on the more internal Western debate or American debate for a bit longer, were civil liberties too compromised for the sake of security? Should intelligence overreach, for example, get back into the Pandora box, Dan Perry?
Always after terrorist attacks, there is widespread public support for curtailing of the public's own rights in order to guarantee safety. So this is a bit of a pendulum that goes back and forth. I tend to think that many things went too far. Some of the restrictions that were put in place seem illogical and have a certain CYA aspect to them. But of course, it's a very difficult thing to talk about as a pundit, because all it needs is one terrorist attack where one thing was overlooked. So there's not much I can say about that. You know, it's an unfortunate situation, and one wishes that it were handled with more intelligence. That sometimes appears to be the case.
Yeah. So easy, quote unquote, to lose the counterterrorism game. It takes just one success.
Were they abused? Of course, there was abuses. That's very clear.
Yeah. Russia's easy. We are nearing the end of the first part of our discussion. You know, I'll ask it simply. Post 9/11, are we living in a safer world or a more dangerous one?
But I think we live in a more dangerous world.
Yeah,
please go.
Should I go? Or?
Please, Arash, yeah.
I think we live in a more dangerous. I think there's no doubt that we live in a more dangerous world, because I mean, not as a direct result of this, but now we have the kind of a state system post 1945 has been very significantly challenged by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we haven't really thought through what it means if Russia gets away with it. If Russia is able to keep parts of Ukraine for a prolonged period, what's there to stopping India from invading Bangladesh, from China from invading Myanmar? I mean, the other systems, and also the fact that China is the biggest, most powerful country in the world after the United States is in no way really committed anymore to the world order the way that it was. We forget that China was kind of friendly to the United States for a long period, and so I think outside of that, it means that we do live in a much more dangerous world, and not to mention the climate reality. That again, there's not enough common work on climate, and I think we live in a very dangerous world. We're gonna when it comes to climate, that might really seriously affect.
All the things you mentioned, many of them had nothing to do with 9/11. So I would kind of agree in different words. I would say that 9/11 reflected the ever-growing dangers in the world, and was not necessarily a cause of it, although it certainly didn't help.
Well, it seems that the bottom line is that 9/11 is to an extent no longer the reference point, Mr. Schanzer.
It's not. I mean, I think certainly for many countries it was the basis for cooperation, multilateral, bilateral cooperation. I think that's all changed. It's now, at least from the U.S. perspective, it's about engagement over great power competition. It's about engagement over supply chain issues. And again, China is going to dominate, I think, from here on out.
All right, gentlemen, we're taking a very short break, but we do have more to unpack right after. So do not go anywhere. You're staying with us, dear panelists, and so should you, dear viewers. A few minutes, and we're back with our summit.